learners, in the last lecture, I spoke about post-colonial literature, and I told you that post-colonial literature is an interaction between the colonizer and the colonized, and it is stemming out of those hegemonic discourses which were trying to distort the image of the native. So let us now have a look at the post-colonial understanding given to us by Ashcroft et al. In their book, The Empire Writes Back. They say that the term post-colonialism in literature highlights the historical realities and socio-political challenges which emerge in parts of the world after the end of the colonial era. According to this approach, post-colonialism deals with the complex issues which are related to identity, culture, ethnicity, language, and democracy in the countries which had experienced the colonial domination. So this claim is fundamentally opposed by the leading post-colonial theorists. Post-colonialism, as it is significantly reduces the scope, historical significance, and complex power relationships characterizing the interaction between the colonial countries and the colonized societies. So, one thing is very clear to us, that the post-colonial literature is talking about the historical realities of the post-war era, and it is not only showing us the historical realities, but is also bringing some socio-political issues related to identity, culture, language, ethnicity, and democracy. So please try to understand that post-colonialism does not mean post-independence or after colonialism, for that would be falsely ascribing it to the end of the colonial process. If you remember, in the first lecture I told you that even post-independence, what happened was that the forms and practices of colonialism changed. Post-colonialism, rather begins from the very first moment of the colonial contract, and it is the discourse of oppositionality which colonialism brings into being. So the post-colonial writings have a very long history. In his seminal work, Orientalism, Edward Said in 1978 produces a discourse analysis of the Western impressions of the Orient. He focuses on the 19th and 20th centuries and mostly refers to the Arabic populations of the Middle East. His work eloquently demonstrates the romanticized and prejudiced Western ideas of the Orient, which have been historically a part of the broad imperial agenda. In the last lecture also, I made a reference to how the Europeans or the Eurocentric opinion was trying to build or trying to construct an image, identity of the native as an inferior being. So, in this sense, art, culture, literature, and aesthetics play a major role in carving certain image about the oppressed populations and even justifying certain geopolitical interventions based on such prejudices. According to Said, Orientalism is never far from a collective notion identifying us, Europeans, against all those non-Europeans, and indeed it can be argued that the major component in European culture is precisely what made that culture hegemonic both in and outside Europe, the idea that European identity is a superior one in comparison to the non-European peoples and cultures. So post-colonialism is a current movement of thoughts and theory which deals with the effects of colonization on the culture and thoughts of the colonized societies. So, what are the changes that occur after the colonized countries get freedom from the colonizers? And the literature that is written to examine all this, is related to the whole corpus labeled as the postcolonial literature. Tony Meyer states, postcolonial literature can be defined as a literature produced by countries that gained independence from colonial rule in the 20th century. In 1900, the British Empire covered a pink swath of a globe that included the Indian subcontinent and other parts of Asia, much of Africa, Australia, Canada, Ireland, many Caribbean islands, as well as numerous and scattered smaller positions. So post-colonialism, is analyzing the cultural differences between the colonizers and the colonized, the Orient and the Occident, the black and the white. In the words of Leela Gandhi, post-colonial theory recognizes that colonial discourses typically rationalize themselves through rigid opposition such as maturity, immaturity, civilization, barbarism, developed, developing, progressive, and primitive. So you see the contrasting concepts that are given, one for the European and the other one for the non-European, trying to show them in a darker light. So post-colonialism attempts to decentralize all Eurocentric notions and norms that are trying to construct the identity of the native. It counters the assumption that Western and European culture is superior to the Eastern culture. Peter Berry explains that post-colonial writers evoke a pre-colonial version of their own nation and culture, which was spoiled by the colonizers during the period of colonialism, and they reject the modern and contemporary colonial status of their countries. So, if the first step toward a post-colonial perspective is to reclaim one's own past, Peter Berry says, then the second is to begin to erode the colonialist ideology by which that past had been devalued. So, it is made clear by Peter Berry in his definition that post-colonialism is not only about reclaiming one's past, but it is also about eroding the colonialist ideology, which was disseminated to devalue them, dehumanize them. So there is a crisis of identity, hybridity, multiculturalism, racial discrimination, and cross-cultural relationship, which you find in abundance in the post-colonial writings. Phenomenal writers of post-colonialism are Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, Bhumike Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak. So they were using this term approximately after the 80s, and imperialism became a concept of the past. All native countries that were colonized by England were in the process to retrieve their lost identities, culture, literature, language that was badly affected and damaged by the colonizer. So, post-colonialism is a period, a phase which tries to recover, discover, find the lost history and identity of the natives. Post-colonialism also tries to unmask or disclose the operations and political, economical ideologies during the period of colonization. According to Pramod K. Nair, post-colonialism is the theoretical wing of post-coloniality. It refers to a mode of reading, political analysis, and cultural resistance, intervention that deals with the history of colonialism and presents new colonial structures. It is, in short, a critique. It invokes ideas such as social justice, emancipation, and democracy in order to oppose oppressive structures of racism, discrimination, and exploitation. So we find plenty books written in the 90s or say in the 20th century which show us all the reclaims that the colonized people were trying to make, and they were trying, how to erode the colonist ideology that was disseminated by the powerful, dominant whites or the Europeans. So you have the wretched of the earth, black skin, white masks, Edward Said's Orientalism, Homi Bhabha's Nation and Narration, Helen Tiffin and Bill Ashcroft's The Empire Writes Back. You should try to read this book because this is a very significant work contributing to the post-colonial studies. So Frantz Fanon states that the colonialism destroyed the very soul of the natives, and they were all represented as evil, pagans, superstitious, and uncivilized, barbaric people. The colonizers were the center. They thought that they were the self and the others were to be pushed to the margins, and they labeled them as others. So MacLeod seconds this statement and he observes the colonizers are civilized, rational, and intelligent. The Negro remains other to all these qualities against which the colonizing peoples derive their sense of superiority and normality. Edward Said also argues that Orientalism is the European ideology that sees the East as begun, savage, undeveloped, and criminal. He describes how Western colonial powers represented the North African and Eastern lands in their writing in the late 19th century and earlier 20th century, and the European colonial powers interpreted the literary work of the native from the standpoint of their already existing misconceptions and ideas about the natives. M.S. Nagarajan states that Orientalism in a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient, it is the result of the arrogant and overbearing attitude of the 20th century European imperialism. It is a description of how the Western powers during colonialism represented the East, their history, their music, their literature, or any other sort, which tried to influence the ways of thinking, perceiving, which led to resistance from the colonized people. Even after acquiring the political independence, cultural and economic dependence continued to linger. So the East was still considered weak, poor, and uncivilized. Homi Bhabha, another leading figure in the field of post-colonialism, writes some works which are representation of the colonial power and shows how the colonial power was trying to influence the colonized and the native. He argues for the identities of the colonized people. So the European constructs his identity through his relationship with the colonized native on the basis of difference between European and native. So the colonizers established their identity by positioning themselves in opposition to the natives. All identity is based on the difference of one's letter, sound, signifier from another. So identity becomes a shifting, relational, displaced, unstatic, kind of a thing. He additionally clarifies the concept of mimicry And while writing in his work of mimicry and men, he contends that mimicry is an imitation of the white man by the native. So, what resulted out of this mimicry was, he contends that the native was being instructed to emulate the white man, and mimicry is brought to the native through culture, religion, fashion, literature, and music. What happens at this stage is that the colonial authority breaks down, and in the colonial encounter between the native and the European, the native becomes anglicized, but never truly European. So the native becomes a mimic man who can now get respect in the colonial establishment and use logic and reasoning and argument. Why? Because he has been taught in the Western education style. Baba argues that mimicry is not fully successful and it fails because the colonial master, on one hand, wants the native to be similar to the white to aid the colonial enterprise, but on the other hand, he also wants him to keep him in a very separate category and think of him as weak, uncivilized, with a slave mentality. So Baba's calls mimicry the sly civility. The mimicry of native is considered deeper disobedience by the white. So this dual state of mimicry is termed as hybridity. So Baba's notion, he has given us this notion of hybridity, which we already have heard of this term in science and other subjects, is when the native refuses to acknowledge the colonizer's position and authority. The native is placed in a position between the adopted Englishness and the original Indianness. So this is the situation of the native having this kind of dual character. Gayatri Spivak, another notable writer of the post-colonial literature, in her essay Can the Subaltern Speak?, actually questions whether the marginalized and the oppressed people can speak. She tries to disclose the condition of the native during the colonial period and the condition of women in this post-colonial period. She argues that the women, they were doubly colonized. Why? Because there was a colonizer and then there was patriarchy, which was again, equivalent to colonization. She argues that one can make his or her identity through a discourse. Pramod K. Nair states, discourse is of course a regime of representation that is controlled by power. This means an individual cannot develop an identity without being the subject of a discourse over which he or she may have little or no control. The subaltern is one who has no position or sovereignty outside the discourse that constructs her as a subject. So I hope by now you have been able to gain some understanding that marginalization, identity, multiculturalism, hybridity, mimicry, and migration are the elements of post-colonial literature. Marginalization occurs, when people are pushed to the edges by the dominant groups. They struggle for their livelihood, their fundamental rights, because they have, they are deprived and they want to chase their dreams, and they also want to gain some kind of economic independence, get good jobs. But even after, achieving so many things, what happens is that there remains some kind of an exclusion, social injustice, and inequality, which is quite common to these marginalized people. So the marginalization also, can be divided on the parameters of societal, political, economic, and spatial. So people can use identity to allude to the different individual qualities or characteristics that highlights but cannot normally be communicated as far as the social class is concerned. So that's a definition of identity from Oxford English Dictionary, which says that the sameness of a person or thing at all times or in all circumstances, the condition of fact that a person or a thing is itself and not something else. Individuality and personality is something that is being indicated and communicated through the word identity. In the words of J.K. Tina Basi, again, identity is positioning between two locations, and identity, again, can have several aspects. Look at 6 aspects: personal, social, natural, national, religious, and cultural. Again, this is an important observation by Radhika Seshan, who says that identity is the vital aspect of one's position, both the natural and social world. At the most elementary level, the identity we have is natural. We are humans belonging to a human species. But this elementary identity itself implies the complexities that follow for as part of the species. There is a sense of group identity and social identity. So, multiculturalism also is another element, as I referred to earlier also. So this is happening because of the different cultural environments, because one is born, brought up, and then because of the influences of the colonizers. So a few observations by MacLeod, who tries to explore the relationship between the North and South Indians because of the cultures, and he says also that there is some kind of a relationship existing because of the migrations. Why the migrations? Because for better opportunities of livelihood and survival. So migrations have happened in the due course of history because of the climatic changes, natural disasters. People move from one place to another, but there might be other reasons as well. But even when people migrate to other places, there is a desire for some kind of a social, political, economic equivalence and social justice. So whenever these people go to a new place for better opportunities, they also seek some kind of equality. So we have the example of various countries where a large number of Indians have migrated to, where their status might be temporary or permanent. But again, these people who migrated for various reasons, have their own reasons: personal, political, internal crisis, external wars, and all this forms a good chunk of the post-colonial literature. So hybridity, the blending of two societies, races, is also leading to a lot of post-colonial writings. So post-colonialism deals with the effects of colonization, its ramifications, and its impact on cultures and society. It constitutes an important idea of scholarship and discourse and is manifested in the writings of our times. I hope you have been able to understand the main elements of post-colonial writings and who were the notable writers. For more knowledge about the post-colonial writings, you can just refer to these sources. Thank you so much.